Tēnā koutou katoa, ngā mihi nui kia koutou e tēnei rā. Ko Brendon Dunphy tōku ingoa, e ho.
Ko Matt Rayner tōku ingoa. Thanks, Brendon. The title of our talk today is Across Space, Time and Molecules. I'm actually still getting over Rochelle's talk. That was just incredible. Yeah, thanks, Rochelle. That's not at all hard act to follow. We're going to talk about space, time, and molecules in our talk, and it's a talk about our bromance over the last 6 years, and it's a tale about how two friends with different research expertise have come together to study something completely different. So the talk's going to go something like, I'm going to tell you a bit about my background, Brendon's going to tell you a little bit about his background, and then we're going to hopefully talk about some of the exciting research we've been doing, looking at these issues of monitoring what's going on in the Gulf and these ecological linkages that Rochelle was talking about. Me personally, for me, my journey in seabird research starts on the greatest island on Earth, Hauturu Otoi, and I just acknowledge mana whenua, Ngāti Manihiri, for the privilege of being able to work in this place. And in 2003, I was shopping around for a PhD research topic, and I was invited by my mentor, now passed on, Mike Imber, to join him on Hauturu for 2 weeks, working on Cook's Petrel. And up there amongst those misty rainforests and the sound of thousands of birds overhead and seeing the impact that rats were having on them, I was hooked. So long story short, fast forward 5 years and I graduated with a PhD. I knew a lot about Cook's Petrel and the effects that rats had on these birds, but also as often happens in life, I'd sort of been around with the right timing, and around that time there'd been the invention of these little devices called geolocators that Dave Towns mentioned earlier. And that sort of had allowed me to look for the first time, had allowed scientists to look for the first time at the behaviours of these birds way out to sea. And so with Cook's Petrel, I was able to see that these birds have this global footprint, that Pacific-wide footprint that we've been talking about. And combining this with museum collections and the genetic data, I was able to look at how these migrations affected the genetic structure of their populations. And this sort of work has expanded, and with a bunch of passionate researchers, advocates, misfits and miscreants from the Northern Seabird Trust and museums and DOC and around the place, we've really expanded knowledge of the impact and the breadth of scale of these seabirds in the Hauraki Gulf. So this is, I won't go into species detail, these are tracking data for 8 species of Hauraki Gulf birds. The little coloured boxes around the birds are colour-coded to the little dots on the map. Take-home point, these birds are going everywhere in the Pacific, and they are connecting us ecologically, and as other speakers have talked about, culturally and spiritually, to the entire Pacific region. It's just incredible. The colour scheme behind is actually a heat map of productivity. These birds are tracking productivity across whole oceanic basin. E hoa? I may have modified Brendon's slide somewhat.
Yeah. So never leave it with a colleague overnight. So this is not the slide I gave him. But anywho. So for something completely different, what fascinates me is the resilience of life, how life does what it does faced with challenges and change. And what Matt has put up here is a whole range of animals, yourselves included. So we have the mussels, the kiwi, the human, and the gruffalo. And in the middle is heat shock protein 70. And so this is what we express, all these organisms express when under stress. And so nature has this toolbox with which it can cope with change. And what fascinates me is just understanding that toolbox and what happens and how does it do it. So here's an example. I'm actually from an invertebrate background, but here's our humble cat's eye. And if we look at the effects of climate change on this species, we measure its habitat temperatures and its ability to cope with these temperatures and some of the molecules it expresses, we see that the northeastern New Zealand coast is more likely to suffer the greater changes coming under climate change than the west coast. And so there's more thermal headroom on the west coast than there is on the east coast, and some of the temperatures on the east coast are starting to reach these lethal temperature ranges. But it's not just within the environment, we can also apply this to the future and aquaculture and ensuring food security in this changing environment.
This is not a photo of 4 seabird scientists looking out to sea at seabirds. It's a photo of an American, a Frenchman, a Dutchman, and a Kiwi, him on the right. I took the photo on a surf trip in the far north. The take-home point is that Brendon and I's sort of collaborative relationship stems from the ocean, but not from seabirds. It stems from a love of riding waves and getting away from work and wives and kids and family and going to places. But the take-home point is we are still nerds, and nerds talk a lot about their work. And on these trips, I started banging on to Brendon about seabirds. He didn't know much about seabirds at the time. And at the same time, Brendon was banging on to me, about bivalves and shellfish and other things living in the Manukau harbour mud. And although that's very interesting, I was working in perhaps more interesting places. And so in 2013, I invited Brendon to join us with Dr. Todd Landers, who's leading monitoring work with the Northern Seabird Trust on the Mokahino Islands. And just would acknowledge the mana of Ngāti Rehua, who are a kaitiaki of that place. And we took Brendon out there to expose him to the wonderful world of seabirds with our now PhD student, Rachel Sagar.
So yes, it's true. Matt talked to me a lot. And over time, I took on the messages. And what he got talking to me about was, you would have seen this figure a lot today, but this beautiful migration that the TT takes as it goes up to Alaska, Japan, and California. And from a physiological perspective, I was like, well, hang on, how does it do that? Is it this amazing Ethiopian marathon runner that just has this amazing aerobic capacity to do that? Or here it is diving into a medium 800 times denser than air. Is it Usain Bolt? Can it just build up these huge anaerobic loads? Is it a super beast? How does it do this? And so from my perspective, this was the hook that got me in. And so we got some money from the university, I think University of Auckland, just to conduct a study. And we chose 3 different species of birds that we knew dove to some degree. On the top left is a beautiful little diving petrel, and I'm hoping you can make out on its back a $800 dive logger, which records depth and time. And so these are very expensive, and of course you just duct tape them on. And then at the same time, we let them go free, do their thing, and we took some samples. We took just some basic measurements of blood. I was practicing this talk on my children this morning, and they said, "Hey, Dad, your hair's got to look greyer." And that sort of threw me for... Yeah, sure. It's stress working for you. But what we found from this data was actually quite fascinating. We find that the diving petrel truly deserves its name. It undertakes a number of short little dives during the day. A lot of its time is underwater, and it's just diving quite shallow but frequently. The grey-faced petrel, yes, it can dive to depth, roughly about 24 metres, but it doesn't do it. It very rarely dives because its food rises up at dusk to it. So it's eating these luminescent squids and all these sorts of fish. And then the sooty shearwater, the TT, its dive behaviour is to go a bit deeper, even down to 92 metres. But what's most impressive about this bird is its duration underwater, an average of 40 seconds, and can be up to a minute and a half. So I challenge you to sit here for the rest of the talk and time yourself doing 40 seconds of breath holding. Then this is a bird the size of a seagull. So William Trowbridge, But what we also did was just for you and on birds, when they go underwater, they have oxygen stores. And so you have your muscles, your lungs, and your blood. And just the graph at the top there is just showing the differences in respiratory oxygen stores among these birds. So as you might expect, the sooty shearwater has less reliance on respiratory oxygen store. So it doesn't want to carry a big balloon of air down with it when it goes to depth. It has more reliance on muscle oxygen store. It's myoglobin. But then the other thing is science is about unexpected opportunities that pop up. And so we started this work in 2013, and over the years, 2014, 15, we worked on this. We noticed that the birds coming from the northern hemisphere were coming back lighter, and they had greater stress parameters indicated in the blood. It's called macrocytic anemia. So their blood cells were bigger, And it just got progressively bigger over those years. And so what it was showing was in the northern hemisphere, over those years, water temperature got up to 5 degrees warmer than normal. So our birds were coming back in very poor condition. And there was a lot of mortality on the beaches, but it got us thinking, well, maybe they're indicating what's going on right over the horizon in the other hemisphere.
Yeah, so that was really interesting. So we started thinking about, like Brendon said, in other hemispheres, but what about locally? We've been talking about these themes of the potential for changes in the bird populations and breeding parameters to tell us about the environment, but what about the molecules? What about their cells? What can that tell us? So at a local level, I'd been doing some work with kawa, 2 species of shags, in particular spotted shag and pied shag here, and using museum specimens to look at isotopes. So Damon talked about isotopes, and in seabird ecology we can use those to look at the trophic level that the birds are feeding on. What are those birds feeding on? So I'd looked at our museum skins here in the Auckland Museum collection and sampled tissue from those skins and looked at changes in the diet of these shags over time. So the figure here shows specimens going back to the 1880s through to the early 2000s. And what this figure is showing through nitrogen isotope is a decline in the trophic level that these birds are feeding on. So and that decline is indicative of a change from a more fish-dominated environment. Rochelle mentioned something about that there's less fish around, clues are all coming together, to a less fish-dominated, more zooplankton-dominated environment. So there was some evidence of local change. And so we started thinking, what could be a possible local study species that we could work on that could tell us about this? And we settled on this little fella here, the kuaka, the common diving petrel, one of the most amazing birds in the Gulf. These little guys, for those of you who don't know, they're like the size of a blackbird, but they're like little flying barrels with stubby little wings. And they were the perfect sort of study system to look at the Gulf. So these guys breed in the winter. These guys come ashore nightly to their burrow, every single night, unlike a shark or a whale or one of those other less important things. They come ashore every night to the burrow, so you can monitor. They're going out locally to feed in the Gulf, so potentially you could monitor what they do. And also, it just so happened that we'd already done, through our work on Pokehino or Burgess Island, we'd already done some work on diving petrels and seen how awesome they were. Diving petrels from Pokehino actually were migrating to the polar front, 3,000 to 5,000 kilometres away in 3 to 13 days. And the reason they were going there, these coloured circles here are outlines of where the birds were going. The heat map shows that primary productivity. In the New Zealand summer, these guys are going down south to feed on zooplankton around that primary productivity. So we knew, potentially we knew these birds might be doing the same thing in the Gulf. So we set about designing a study, and we worked on Pokehino, Burgess Island, and on Tiritiri Matangi Island. And there we wanted to look at the ecology of diving petrels during the breeding season in a number of different ways. First, with this new range of ultralight high-resolution GPS tags, which weigh 4 grams, we were going to see where these respective populations were moving at the same time. Secondly, through blood plasma, we could look at the little isotopes, tell if there were differences in these populations. And thirdly, look at the blood parameters of stress and see if there was any differences between populations relating to differences in local foraging, i.e. could these birds be a useful tool for monitoring in the Gulf and come at things from a slightly different angle. And so here is tracking results data. The little coloured circles are individual diving petrels moving out from the 2 island colonies. And the heat map behind is just sea surface temperature. So what we found was that certainly during incubation, these birds are foraging in radically different foraging habitats. But were they feeding on different things? Well, when we looked at those little isotopes, sure enough, there was a radical difference in the ecology of what these birds were feeding on. So birds on Tiritiri Matangi, feeding on a predominantly fish-orientated diet in the inner Gulf, and I won't go too much into the carbon signature, but essentially an isotopic carbon signature tells you about inshore versus offshore foraging. So the tiri birds were feeding inshore, as we already know from the tracking data, feeding more on fish, Mokahino birds were feeding more offshore, and their diet was more dominated by zooplankton, and particularly things like euphasids and krill.
So at this point, I just need to acknowledge Shay Vickers, who this is basically her work, but what she was looking at and what we're going to claim as ours was the stress hormones in the blood. And what we see here is there's two distinct differences between the islands. So you express these stress hormones as well, just a different type. So not only is there dietary differences between the birds, but they're also, Mokahino Islands seem to be at this point in time more stressed, and so there was these distinct spatial differences in the stress profiles among these colonies, which is quite fascinating. Not only that, once we compiled all the data that we'd been working on for the last 4 or so years, including some from Chris Gaskin, is that we noticed over this time the actual weights of the birds have been dropping off, and we're also seeing over this time, this is at Mokahino Islands, that the blood stress parameters are also increasing over this time. So from year on year, they've been more and more stressed. They've got more of this macrocytic anemia that I'm talking about with the increased red blood cell size. And so this is caused by many things. It could be dietary or stress. So we need to unpick what it is. But nonetheless, over this time, there just seems to be this general decrease that we weren't really aware of until we brought all the data together. So we're going out next week to get the 2017 data set. Now, I'm not going to base my scientific career on this, but 2010 was a moderate El Nino. 2013, mild to no El Nino. 2015 and 16, as Rochelle just talked about, strong El Nino. So there's potentially is an effect here that we're picking up, not only in the bird weight, but in the internal physiology of the bird as well.
Final slide. Really, it's pretty clear that the theme of today is about collaboration. So an acknowledgement slide is a perfect way for me to sort of cap that off. And our work has been, essentially based upon collaboration between Brendon and myself, but this whole range of different people that have contributed to this work that we're excited about, that has potentially some potential for ways to monitor change in the Gulf using seabirds. And we would just exhort forum members to also continue forward this spirit of collaboration. There's a lot of good things have been done. There's still a lot of work to be done in the Gulf, and we look forward to progress being made into the future. And thank you very much.